Hello, I am Michael. I am 34 years old, and I have just discovered that my own mother was willing to orchestrate an elaborate scheme to steal my inheritance in front of lawyers. But what she did not realize is that I had been anticipating this betrayal for years, and I had prepared accordingly. Before I reveal how I completely destroyed my mother's plan, hit that subscribe button if you've ever dealt with greedy family members who think they deserve your money. The telephone call that would change everything arrived on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting in my modest apartment kitchen, reviewing construction blueprints for a small renovation project, when the shrill ring of my phone pierced the morning silence. The caller identification displayed a name that had become synonymous with manipulation and emotional warfare. Linda Hartwell, my mother. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the answer button. Our conversations had become increasingly strained since my father's passing 13 months earlier, particularly after the reading of his will revealed that he had left his entire life savings to me. The memory of that day still haunted me. The way her face had contorted with barely concealed rage when the attorney announced that Robert Hartwell had bequeathed his $200,000 exclusively to his eldest son. Against my better judgment, I answered the call. "Michael, darling." Her voice flowed through the receiver with that artificially sweet tone she reserved for occasions when she required something significant from me. "How wonderful to hear your voice. I hope I am not interrupting anything important." The word darling felt like poison honey on her tongue. Linda Hartwell had never been particularly affectionate, and hearing such endearments from her immediately triggered my internal alarm systems. Something was decidedly wrong with this picture. "Hello, Mother, what can I do for you?" "Oh, Michael, you sound so formal. Cannot a mother simply call to speak with her son?" She paused, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in her mind. "Actually, I was calling with a wonderful idea. What would you think about joining us for dinner this Saturday evening? It has been far too long since we gathered as a family." Family. The word hung in the air like a bitter joke. The concept of family had been systematically destroyed in our household long before my father's death, eroded by years of criticism, manipulation, and emotional neglect. The irony of Linda invoking family unity now, after months of demanding that I surrender portions of my inheritance, was not lost on me. "A family dinner?" I repeated, unable to mask the skepticism in my voice. "When was the last time you invited me for dinner, Mother?" "Michael, really? Must you be so suspicious? I realize we have had our differences regarding your father's will, but surely we can set aside those disagreements for one evening. Jessica will be joining us as well. She has been asking about you constantly." Jessica, my 28-year-old sister who had inherited our mother's talent for emotional manipulation and her complete disdain for our father's working-class values. The same Jessica who had not spoken to me directly since the will reading, choosing instead to communicate through passive-aggressive social media posts about greedy siblings and family betrayal. "What exactly are we celebrating?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Must there be a specific occasion for a family to come together? I simply thought it would be lovely to reconnect. Perhaps we could discuss how to move forward as a family." There it was, the barely concealed agenda lurking beneath her maternal facade. This was not about reconciliation or family bonding. This was another calculated attempt to pressure me into surrendering my inheritance. "Mother, if this is another attempt to convince me to alter the terms of Father's will—" "Michael, please. I would never dream of discussing such matters over the telephone. This is simply about family, about healing the wounds that have divided us." The manipulation was masterful, I had to admit. She was positioning herself as the peacemaker, the grieving widow who simply wanted to reunite her fractured family. Anyone listening to this conversation would have perceived her as the reasonable party and me as the suspicious, money-obsessed son. But I knew Linda Hartwell better than most people. I had spent 34 years observing her methods, studying her patterns, learning to recognize the subtle shifts in her voice that indicated when she was preparing to strike. And every instinct I possessed was screaming that this dinner invitation was a trap. "Saturday evening," I repeated slowly. "Just the three of us?" "Yes, just us. Although—" She paused, and I could sense her choosing her words carefully. "I may have mentioned to a few people that we were finally getting together. You know how word spreads in small communities. But it will primarily be just family. A few people. Word spreads. These were not casual remarks. They were deliberate hints that this gathering would have witnesses, people who could later testify to whatever narrative Linda intended to construct. My mind began racing through the possibilities. What was she planning? What leverage did she believe she possessed that would compel me to surrender my father's life savings? Had she discovered some legal loophole, some way to contest the will that she had not previously explored? "Michael, are you still there, darling?" "Yes, I am here. I am simply surprised by this invitation." "Surprised?" "Michael, I understand that we have had our disagreements, but surely you recognize that family is more important than money. Your father would have wanted us to remain united." The audacity of invoking my father's memory was breathtaking. Robert Hartwell had spent the final years of his life watching his wife systematically undermine and belittle him. He had confided in me during those last months about Linda's increasing demands for a more affluent lifestyle, her constant criticism of his career choices, her obvious embarrassment about his blue-collar profession. "What time on Saturday?" I heard myself asking, despite every rational part of my mind screaming warnings. 7 o'clock would be perfect. I am planning something very special for the evening, something that I believe will help us all move forward together. Something special. The phrase sent chills down my spine. When Linda Hartwell described something as special, it invariably meant that someone was about to experience a very unpleasant surprise. "Very well, Mother. I will see you Saturday at 7. "Wonderful. Oh, Michael, I am so looking forward to this. It is going to be a night that changes everything for our family." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. Changes everything for our family. What exactly did she mean by that? I set the phone down and walked to the window of my apartment, gazing out at the construction site across the street where workers were laying the foundation for a new office building. The sight reminded me of my father, of the countless hours he had spent on similar projects, building structures that would outlast him by decades. Robert Hartwell had been a man of simple pleasures and profound integrity. He had never sought wealth or recognition, only the satisfaction of honest work and the security of providing for his family. The $200,000 he had accumulated represented 42 years of disciplined saving, of choosing practical over luxurious, of sacrificing his own comfort for the promise of leaving something meaningful to his children. But Linda had never appreciated those sacrifices. She had viewed his profession as an embarrassment, his modest income as a personal failure. During the final months of his life, when his heart condition had begun to worsen, she had grown increasingly vocal about her dissatisfaction with their financial situation. "Robert, look at the Hendersons," she would say, gesturing toward our neighbor's newly renovated kitchen. "Tom Henderson makes twice what you make, and he started working 10 years after you did. When are you going to stop playing in the dirt and find a real career?" My father would simply nod and continue reading his newspaper, but I could see the pain in his eyes. The woman he had loved and supported for 38 years was systematically destroying his self-worth, one criticism at a time. 3 weeks before his death, my father had called me to his bedside and explained his decision regarding the will. "Michael," he had said, his voice weak but determined, "I have been thinking about what happens to the money when I am gone. I know your mother expects me to divide everything equally between you and Jessica, but I cannot do that." "Why not, Dad?" "Because you are the only one who has ever respected what I do. You are the only one who understands that this money represents more than numbers in a bank account. It represents dignity, hard work, and sacrifice. Linda and Jessica see it as something they deserve simply by virtue of existing." He had gripped my hand with surprising strength for a man in his condition. I want you to have it all, son. Every dollar. Use it to build something meaningful. Use it to honor the values that I tried to teach you. And whatever you do not let them guilt you into giving it away. Now, 13 months later, I was facing the consequences of that decision. Linda had spent the entire year attempting to convince me to share the inheritance, employing every manipulation tactic in her considerable arsenal. She had tried guilt, claiming that my father had been confused in his final months. She had tried logic, arguing that equal distribution was only fair. She had tried emotional blackmail, suggesting that keeping the entire inheritance was destroying the family. But I had remained steadfast, partly because I respected my father's wishes, and partly because I had come to understand that surrendering to Linda's demands would only enable her destructive behavior. Saturday's dinner invitation represented a new escalation in her campaign. She was no longer content with phone calls and surprise visits. She was planning something more elaborate, more public, more difficult for me to simply walk away from. As I stood at my window watching the construction workers methodically lay concrete blocks, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could decline the invitation, avoiding whatever trap Linda had prepared, or I could attend the dinner, face whatever she had planned, and finally put an end to this psychological warfare once and for all. The memory of my father's words echoed in my mind. Do not let them guilt you into giving it away. But perhaps it was time for a different approach. Perhaps it was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had memorized years earlier. Mitchell & Sons Law Firm. This is Thomas Mitchell speaking. Mr. Mitchell, this is Michael Hartwell. I believe it is time we had a conversation about my mother's recent activities. Michael, I have been expecting your call. How much do you know about attempted inheritance fraud? The question hung in the air like a promise of justice. As I began to explain the details of Saturday's mysterious dinner invitation, I realized that Linda Hartwell had made a critical error in judgment. She had assumed that I would remain passive, that I would continue to absorb her attacks without fighting back. She had mistaken my respect for my father's memory as weakness, my desire to avoid conflict as inability to defend myself. But she was about to discover that Robert Hartwell had taught his son more than just the value of hard work and integrity. He had also taught me that sometimes the only way to protect what matters most is to be prepared for war. To comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal that was unfolding, one must understand the intricate web of resentment, manipulation, and emotional abuse that had been woven throughout the Hartwell household over the course of 3 decades. The foundation of this family's destruction had been laid long before my father's death, brick by brick, through years of systematic psychological warfare disguised as marriage and motherhood. Robert Hartwell had met Linda Morrison in the spring of 1985, when he was 26 years old and she was 23. He had been working as a junior foreman on a residential construction project in the affluent suburb of Westfield, where Linda worked as a receptionist at an upscale dental practice. The attraction between them had been immediate and, from my father's perspective, transformative. Linda Morrison had possessed the kind of polished beauty that seemed to emanate from a different world than the one my father inhabited. She wore designer clothing that somehow never appeared wrinkled, maintained perfectly manicured nails despite her modest salary, and spoke with the refined diction of someone who had studied elocution. To a man who had spent his entire adult life working with his hands, covered in sawdust and concrete residue, Linda represented sophistication and elegance beyond his wildest dreams. What my father had failed to recognize in those early months of courtship was that Linda Morrison had been conducting an audition rather than falling in love. She had been 23 years old, living in a studio apartment and watching her friends from high school marry men with college degrees and promising careers. Robert Hartwell, with his steady income and obvious devotion, had represented security and stability, qualities that Linda valued far more than passion or compatibility. The early years of their marriage had been marked by what Linda would later refer to as compromises. She had agreed to live in Robert's modest 2-bedroom house in a working-class neighborhood, with the understanding that it was temporary. She had accepted his blue-collar profession, with the expectation that he would eventually transition into management or, preferably, an entirely different field. She had even agreed to have children, believing that motherhood would provide her with the social status and purpose that seemed to elude her in other areas of life. But as the years progressed and Robert showed no inclination to abandon the work he loved, Linda's compromises had gradually transformed into resentments. The temporary house became a permanent embarrassment. The blue-collar profession became a source of social humiliation. The children became additional financial burdens that prevented her from pursuing the lifestyle she believed she deserved. I have vivid memories of my childhood that, when viewed through adult eyes, reveal the systematic erosion of my father's self-worth. Linda had possessed a remarkable talent for delivering criticism that sounded almost like constructive concern. "Robert, darling, I noticed that the Williamses have hired a landscaping company to redesign their backyard. It looks absolutely stunning. Perhaps when you receive your next promotion, we could consider something similar." The implication, of course, was that my father's efforts to maintain our modest yard were inadequate by comparison. The mention of his next promotion served as a reminder that his current position was disappointing. The entire comment was structured to make him feel simultaneously criticized and loved. "Robert, I was speaking with Margaret Henderson at the grocery store today. She mentioned that her husband Tom has been promoted to regional sales manager. Apparently, the position comes with a company car and an expense account. Have you considered whether there might be similar opportunities in your field?" This particular style of commentary had been a constant presence throughout my childhood. Linda would present examples of other men's success as casual conversation, always framed as innocent inquiry about my father's potential for similar achievements. The cumulative effect had been devastating. My father would respond to these observations with patient explanations about the realities of the construction industry, the satisfaction he derived from building tangible structures, the security that came from possessing skills that would always be in demand. But I could observe the gradual dimming of light in his eyes as Linda's disappointment became increasingly difficult to ignore. Jessica had entered this dynamic as Linda's natural ally and my father's unconscious adversary. Born when I was 6 years old, she had been raised to view our father's profession through the lens of Linda's embarrassment. Where I had spent childhood afternoons visiting construction sites and learning to appreciate the artistry involved in skilled craftsmanship, Jessica had learned to feel ashamed of bringing friends home because our house was smaller than theirs. Our car was older. Our vacations were less exotic. "Daddy, why do you have to wear those dirty clothes to work?" Jessica had asked when she was perhaps 8 years old. "Jamie's father wears suits to work and he always looks nice." The question had been innocent enough coming from a child, but Linda's response had been telling. "Your father works very hard, sweetheart, but some people choose different kinds of careers. Perhaps when you grow up, you can marry someone who works in an office instead of getting dirty every day." The message had been clear. Robert's chosen profession was something to be tolerated rather than respected, survived rather than celebrated. Jessica had absorbed this lesson completely, gradually developing the same disdain for our father's work that Linda had always harbored. By the time Jessica reached adolescence, the dynamics within our household had calcified into predictable patterns. Linda would make subtle comments about our financial limitations compared to other families. Jessica would express embarrassment about our modest lifestyle, and my father would work longer hours, take on additional projects, and save every possible dollar in a desperate attempt to prove his worth to a family that had already decided he was insufficient. The symbolic representation of this family dysfunction had manifested itself in Linda's treatment of my father's work clothes. Every evening, Robert would return home covered in the honest evidence of his labor: sawdust in his hair, concrete dust on his boots, paint stains on his shirts. Rather than viewing these marks as badges of honor, Linda had treated them as contamination that needed to be immediately contained and eliminated. "Robert, please remove those clothes in the laundry room before you enter the main house," she would say. "I cannot have you tracking that dirt through the living room when we might have guests." The laundry room had gradually evolved into a decontamination chamber where my father was required to strip away not just his work clothes, but symbolically, his professional identity before he was permitted to rejoin his family. He would emerge from that room transformed from Robert Hartwell, skilled craftsman and provider, into Robert Hartwell, domesticated husband who needed to shower away the evidence of his inadequacy. This ritual had continued for years, creating a psychological barrier between the man my father was during his working hours, confident, respected, accomplished, and the man he was permitted to be within his own home. The financial aspects of our family's dysfunction had been equally complex and destructive. Despite Linda's constant complaints about our modest lifestyle, my father had been remarkably successful at accumulating savings. His frugal nature, combined with steady employment and careful budgeting, had allowed him to set aside substantial amounts of money over the decades. But Linda had never acknowledged these savings as evidence of my father's financial responsibility. Instead, she had viewed the money as proof that he was deliberately withholding a better lifestyle from his family. "If you have been saving all this money, Robert, why are we still living in this house? Why am I still driving a car that is 8 years old? What exactly are you saving for?" My father's response had always been the same. "I am saving for our future, Linda, for emergencies, for retirement, for the children's education. I want to ensure that we will always be secure." But Linda had interpreted this prudence as selfishness, this security as stinginess. She had wanted immediate gratification, visible improvements to their lifestyle, tangible evidence that their neighbors could observe and envy. The tragic irony was that my father had been saving for exactly the kind of future that Linda claimed to want. His $200,000 represented the foundation for a comfortable retirement, the means to pay for Jessica's college education, the security that would have allowed Linda to reduce her working hours and pursue her interests. But because these benefits were potential rather than immediate, invisible rather than ostentatious, Linda had never valued them appropriately. The deterioration of my parents' relationship had accelerated dramatically during my father's final years. As his heart condition had worsened and his physical capabilities had diminished, Linda's criticism had become more frequent and more cruel. "Robert, you need to seriously consider what you are going to do when you can no longer perform physical labor. We cannot survive on disability payments. You should have been planning for this transition years ago." The observation was technically accurate. My father's weakening heart did necessitate consideration of alternative career paths, but Linda's delivery had been designed to maximize anxiety rather than encourage productive planning. During the final months of my father's life, when he had been forced to reduce his working hours and accept less physically demanding assignments, Linda had begun making comments that bordered on emotional abuse. "I never imagined that I would spend my 50s caring for an invalid," she had said within my earshot, apparently believing that my father was asleep in his bedroom. "I married a strong man, not someone who needs help climbing stairs." The comment had been devastating in its casual cruelty. My father had spent 42 years supporting his family through physical labor, literally building the foundation for their security and comfort. The idea that his temporary weakness made him a burden, rather than a man deserving of care and respect, had revealed the depth of Linda's fundamental selfishness. It was during this period of vulnerability and increasing awareness of his mortality that my father had made the decision to revise his will. He had confided in me about his reasoning during one of our final conversations. "Michael, I have been observing your mother and sister very carefully these past few months. I have seen how they react to my illness, how they speak about our financial situation, how they plan for a future that assumes I will no longer be part of it." He had paused, struggling with the effort required to speak clearly despite his weakening condition. "Your mother has never appreciated the sacrifices I made to provide for this family. She has never understood that this money represents more than numbers in a bank account. It represents dignity, discipline, and delayed gratification. Jessica has inherited her mother's attitude toward money. She sees it as something she deserves, rather than something that must be earned." The conversation had been heartbreaking and enlightening in equal measure. My father had spent his final weeks observing his family with the clarity that often accompanies approaching death, and he had reached conclusions that must have been profoundly painful. "But you, Michael, have always understood the value of honest work. You have never been embarrassed by what I do for a living. You have never suggested that I should be something other than what I am. That is why I want you to have everything." 3 weeks later, Robert Hartwell had died of cardiac arrest while reviewing blueprints for a small office renovation. His final act had been to initial a change order for upgraded materials, ensuring that the building would be constructed to standards higher than the minimum requirements. The will reading had taken place on a gray December morning in the offices of Mitchell & Sons law firm. Thomas Mitchell, my father's attorney and longtime friend, had delivered the news with professional composure, but I could detect the tension in his voice as he read the relevant passages. To my beloved son, Michael Hartwell, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all savings accounts, investment holdings, and personal property, totaling approximately $200,000. It is my sincere hope that Michael will use this inheritance to build a life founded on the principles of integrity, hard work, and respect for others. The silence that had followed this announcement had been profound and ominous. Linda had remained perfectly still for perhaps 30 seconds, her face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and finally, rage. "This cannot be correct," she had said finally, her voice dangerously quiet. "Robert promised me that everything would be divided equally among his family members." Thomas Mitchell had responded with professional courtesy, masking obvious discomfort. "Mrs. Hartwell, I can assure you that this will was prepared according to your husband's explicit instructions. He was quite clear about his intentions." His intentions? Linda's voice had risen to a near shriek. His intentions were obviously influenced by someone who had been manipulating him during his illness. Michael has been filling his head with lies about his own family. The accusation had been both predictable and infuriating. Rather than accepting that my father had made an informed decision based on years of observation and consideration, Linda had immediately concluded that some form of external manipulation must have been involved. Jessica had remained silent during this exchange, but her expression had conveyed complete agreement with her mother's assessment. From their perspective, the idea that Robert Hartwell might have deliberately excluded them from his will was incomprehensible. Therefore, I must have somehow coerced him into this decision. The meeting had concluded with Linda's ominous promise to explore all available legal options, and Jessica's tearful declaration that I had destroyed our family for money. Over the following months, their efforts to contest the will had been persistent but unsuccessful. They had consulted multiple attorneys, researched precedents for inheritance disputes, and even attempted to gather testimony from neighbors and family friends who might support claims of mental incompetence or undue influence. But Thomas Mitchell had prepared my father's will with meticulous attention to potential challenges. Medical records confirmed that Robert Hartwell had been mentally competent at the time of the will's preparation. Multiple witnesses had attested to his clear understanding of the document's implications. Most importantly, the will itself contained detailed explanations for his decisions that demonstrated careful thought and deliberate intention. Unable to successfully challenge the will through legal channels, Linda and Jessica had shifted their strategy toward emotional manipulation and psychological pressure. They had enlisted extended family members, family friends, and even neighbors in a campaign designed to convince me that keeping the entire inheritance was morally wrong. "Michael, your father would roll over in his grave if he knew you were keeping money that should support his widow," my Aunt Margaret had said during an unexpected phone call. "I cannot believe you would be so selfish," my cousin David had written in a lengthy email. "Family is supposed to take care of family." The pressure had been relentless and sophisticated. Every appeal had been carefully crafted to exploit different aspects of guilt, responsibility, and social obligation. But I had remained steadfast, partly because I respected my father's wishes, and partly because I had come to understand the destructive nature of enabling Linda's manipulative behavior. Now, as Saturday's dinner invitation loomed, I realized that Linda had exhausted her conventional options and was preparing to escalate to more desperate measures. The fact that she was organizing some kind of formal gathering, with unspecified guests and promises that the evening would be special, suggested that she had developed a new strategy. But as I sat in my apartment on Wednesday evening, reviewing the notes I had taken during my phone conversation with Thomas Mitchell, I realized that Linda Hartwell had made a critical miscalculation. She had assumed that I would remain reactive, that I would continue to respond to her initiatives rather than developing my own. She had mistaken my desire to avoid family conflict for inability to defend myself when necessary. What she did not realize was that I had spent the past 13 months not only protecting my inheritance, but carefully documenting every attempt she had made to manipulate, coerce, or defraud me out of it. And now, finally, I was ready to use that documentation in ways that would permanently end her campaign of psychological warfare. Thomas Mitchell had been very interested to learn about Linda's recent activities, particularly her attempts to gather testimony about my father's alleged mental incompetence. He had been especially intrigued by the mysterious phone call that someone had made to his office, posing as a journalist and asking leading questions about Robert Hartwell's cognitive abilities during his final months. "Michael," he had said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had finally been given the tools to solve a complex puzzle, "I believe your mother is about to make a very serious mistake, and when she does, we will be ready for her." Saturday evening arrived with the oppressive weight of an approaching storm. As I prepared for what I suspected would be the final confrontation in this prolonged psychological warfare, I found myself experiencing a peculiar combination of dread and anticipation. The events of the past week had crystallized my understanding of Linda's capabilities and limitations, and I was no longer the reactive, defensive son she had been manipulating for over a year. Thomas Mitchell and I had spent considerable time developing what he referred to as contingency protocols for various scenarios that might unfold during the evening. We had prepared documentation, gathered evidence, and most importantly, arranged for resources that Linda could not have anticipated. The meticulous preparation had been oddly comforting, transforming my anxiety into something approaching confidence. At 6:30, I dressed carefully in the navy blazer and gray slacks that my father had given me for my 30th birthday, an outfit that projected respectability without ostentation. I wanted to appear composed and professional, regardless of whatever emotional manipulations awaited me. As I adjusted my tie in the bathroom mirror, I caught sight of my father's watch on my wrist, a simple timepiece that had accompanied him through 4 decades of honest labor. "Give me strength, Dad," I whispered to the reflection. "Help me honor your memory the right way." The drive to my childhood home took 23 minutes through streets that held countless memories of a family that had once possessed the potential for happiness. As I turned onto Maple Street, I observed the familiar neighborhood where my father had been proud to provide a safe, comfortable environment for his children. The modest 2-story house where I had grown up appeared unchanged from the exterior, but I knew that the dynamics within had been permanently altered by grief, greed, and resentment. I parked my Honda Civic in the driveway behind Linda's silver Lexus, a vehicle that had been purchased 2 months after my father's death, ostensibly to help her cope with the stress of widowhood. The irony of using my father's life insurance payout to purchase a luxury car while simultaneously claiming financial hardship had not been lost on me. As I approached the front door, I noticed several unusual details that immediately heightened my alertness. The living room curtains, which were normally open during evening hours, had been drawn completely closed. The porch light had been turned off, creating an atmosphere of secrecy rather than welcome. Most telling, there were 2 additional vehicles parked on the street directly in front of the house, a black Mercedes sedan and a dark blue BMW, cars that clearly did not belong to neighbors or family friends. Professional vehicles. Expensive, understated, the kind of transportation that suggested serious business conducted by people who charged substantial hourly fees. I rang the doorbell and waited, listening to the sound of multiple voices inside the house, suddenly falling silent. Footsteps approached the door, followed by the distinctive click of the deadbolt being disengaged. Linda opened the door wearing her most elaborate false smile and a black cocktail dress that seemed inappropriately formal for a simple family dinner. "Michael, how wonderful that you could join us. Please come in, come in." The enthusiasm in her voice was so exaggerated that it bordered on theatrical. She was performing for an audience, and that audience was clearly waiting inside the house. As I stepped through the threshold, the first thing I noticed was the scent. Not the aroma of dinner preparation, but the sterile smell of expensive cologne and nervous perspiration. The second observation was even more alarming. The living room had been completely rearranged. The comfortable furniture that had accommodated our family for decades had been repositioned to create a formal meeting space, with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a central area where additional seating had been provided. This was not a dinner party. This was a tribunal. "Mother," I said slowly, "I do not smell any food cooking. Where exactly is this family dinner you mentioned?" "Oh, we decided to delay the meal slightly," Linda replied, her voice carrying forced brightness that fooled absolutely no one. "We have some guests who wanted to meet you first. I hope you do not mind the change in plans." Guests. The word hung in the air like a threat. What kind of guests? Before Linda could respond, two men emerged from the kitchen, each carrying leather briefcases and wearing the kind of serious expressions that suggested they were accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. They were clearly attorneys, and their presence in my mother's living room could only mean one thing. This evening was about legal coercion rather than family reconciliation. The first man, approximately 50 years old with silver hair and an expensive charcoal suit, approached me with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating people through sheer professional authority. "Mr. Hartwell, I presume? I am Richard Patterson from the law firm of Patterson & Associates. This is my colleague, James Williams." He gestured toward the younger man, who appeared nervous and kept glancing at Linda as though seeking direction. "Your mother and sister have retained our services to address some irregularities concerning your father's estate." Irregularities. The word was chosen deliberately to imply that my inheritance was somehow illegitimate or suspicious. "What irregularities?" I asked, though I already understood that this entire evening had been orchestrated as an ambush designed to pressure me into surrendering my father's legacy. Patterson exchanged a meaningful glance with Linda before responding. "Perhaps we should all sit down. This is a complex situation that requires careful discussion." "I prefer to stand," I replied. "Please explain what you believe these irregularities to be." Linda positioned herself between me and the attorneys, assuming the posture of a grieving widow who had been forced to take drastic action to protect her family's interests. "Michael, darling, please try to understand. We have discovered some very troubling information about the circumstances surrounding your father's will. There are questions about whether he was truly competent to make such significant decisions during his final months." Competent. Another carefully chosen word designed to cast doubt on my father's mental state, and by extension, the validity of his final wishes. "My father was perfectly lucid when he revised his will," I stated firmly. "Thomas Mitchell can attest to that fact, as can the medical professionals who examined him." Williams, the younger attorney, spoke for the first time, his voice betraying the nervousness that his colleague was attempting to conceal. "Mr. Hartwell, we have obtained statements from several individuals who observed concerning changes in your father's behavior during his final year, neighbors who witnessed arguments, family friends who noticed confusion, medical staff who documented episodes of disorientation." The assertion was delivered with enough specificity to sound credible, but I recognized it as a carefully constructed fabrication. My father had indeed experienced the physical deterioration that accompanies heart disease, but his mental faculties had remained sharp until the very end. "I would like to see these statements," I said. Patterson opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "Of course, we have affidavits from Margaret Morrison, David Hartford, and several staff members from Westfield General Hospital. All of them express concerns about your father's cognitive abilities during the period when the will was allegedly revised. Margaret Morrison was Linda's sister, who had always resented my father's working-class background. David Hartford was a neighbor who had been involved in a property line dispute with my father years earlier. The hospital staff members were likely individuals who had interacted with my father during brief medical appointments and possessed no meaningful insight into his mental condition. But the existence of these statements, regardless of their validity, demonstrated the sophistication of Linda's strategy. She had spent months gathering testimony that could be used to construct a narrative of mental incompetence. "Furthermore," Patterson continued, "we have evidence suggesting that you exercised undue influence over your father during his vulnerable final months. Multiple witnesses report that you visited him with unusual frequency, often staying for extended periods without other family members present. The accusation was breathtaking in its audacity. My regular visits to my father, which had been motivated by love and concern for his deteriorating health, were being reframed as evidence of manipulation and coercion. Are you suggesting that spending time with my dying father was somehow inappropriate? We are suggesting, Patterson replied with legal precision, that the timing and nature of those visits, combined with the dramatic change in testamentary disposition, raises serious questions about the authenticity of your father's final wishes. Linda stepped forward, tears beginning to form in her eyes with practiced ease. Michael, no one is questioning your love for your father, but surely you can understand how difficult this has been for Jessica and me. To be completely excluded from his will after 38 years of marriage and 28 years of daughterhood, it simply does not make sense unless someone was influencing his decisions. The performance was masterful. Linda had positioned herself as the confused and heartbroken widow who simply could not comprehend why her devoted husband would leave her financially destitute. Anyone observing this scene would naturally sympathize with her apparent bewilderment and pain. Jessica emerged from the kitchen at precisely this moment, her timing so perfect that it was obviously choreographed. She had been crying, or at least applying makeup to simulate the effects of crying, and she moved to stand beside Linda in a display of feminine solidarity against masculine greed. Michael, Jessica said, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion. Please help us understand. Did Daddy really intend to leave us with nothing? Did he really want his wife and daughter to struggle financially while his son becomes wealthy? The questions were designed to exploit every aspect of guilt and family obligation that might influence my decision. Jessica was presenting herself not as a grown woman capable of supporting herself, but as a helpless victim abandoned by her father's inexplicable cruelty. Williams withdrew additional documents from his briefcase, spreading them across the coffee table that had been repositioned to serve as a conference table. Mr. Hartwell, we have prepared a settlement agreement that we believe addresses everyone's concerns fairly. Under the terms of this agreement, you would retain 60% of your father's estate, while your mother and sister would each receive 20%. This arrangement acknowledges your father's apparent preference for you, while ensuring that his wife and daughter are not left destitute. 60%. The offer was structured to sound generous while actually representing a massive concession on my part. They were asking me to surrender $80,000 to resolve their manufactured crisis. Patterson slid the documents across the table toward me. This agreement also includes language that would prevent any future legal challenges to the estate. Once signed, all parties would be bound by these terms, ensuring that this unfortunate situation can be resolved permanently. I looked down at the papers, observing the legal language that had been carefully crafted to legitimize what was essentially extortion. The document was professionally prepared, complete with notary requirements and witness signatures. This was not a hastily conceived plan. It was the culmination of months of preparation and strategic thinking. And if I refused to sign this agreement? The question hung in the air for several seconds, before Patterson responded with the kind of measured threat that attorneys have perfected over centuries of practice. Mr. Hartwell, I hope that will not be necessary. However, if you choose not to accept this reasonable settlement, we will have no choice but to pursue litigation. Contesting a will is an expensive and time-consuming process that could ultimately cost far more than the concessions we are requesting. Additionally, such proceedings would become matters of public record, potentially damaging to your reputation and professional relationships. The threat was comprehensive and well-constructed. Financial pressure, temporal pressure, and social pressure, all delivered with the veneer of reluctant necessity. Linda moved closer, reaching out as though to touch my arm in a gesture of maternal concern. Michael, please. I know your father raised you to be a reasonable man. He would want his family to remain united, not torn apart by fighting over money. Jessica and I are not asking for equal shares. We recognize that he wanted you to have the majority. We are simply asking for enough to maintain our dignity and security. Dignity and security. The words were chosen to evoke my father's own values. suggesting that refusing their demands would somehow violate the principles he had tried to instill in me. I stood in the center of that reconfigured living room, surrounded by attorneys and family members who had conspired to ambush me with legal documents and emotional manipulation. The sophistication of their strategy was impressive. They had anticipated my potential objections and prepared responses designed to counter every argument I might raise. But as I looked around at the faces staring at me with carefully crafted expressions of hope and concern, I realized that Linda Hartwell had made one critical miscalculation in her elaborate scheme. She had assumed that I would arrive at this meeting unprepared and isolated, overwhelmed by the sudden presentation of legal documents and family pressure. She had believed that catching me off guard would force me into making an impulsive decision that I would later regret. What she had not anticipated was that I had spent the past week preparing for exactly this scenario, developing my own strategy with the assistance of professionals who understood the law far better than Patterson and Williams. I smiled slowly, feeling a sense of calm confidence that surprised even me. "Oh," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room with perfect clarity. "You'll want to hear what my guest has to say." The silence that followed my statement was profound and electric. Every person in the room froze, their carefully composed expressions shifting toward confusion and alarm. Linda's mouth opened slightly, as though she wanted to speak but could not find words. Patterson and Williams exchanged glances that conveyed sudden uncertainty about the evening's trajectory. "What guest?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mentioned that you had told several people about our family gathering," I replied, maintaining that mysterious smile. "I took the liberty of extending an invitation to someone who has a particular interest in estate law and family dynamics." Jessica stepped backward, her face draining of color. "Michael, what are you talking about?" Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tension like a blade, causing everyone in the room to turn toward the front door with expressions of dread and anticipation. Patterson was already reaching for his briefcase as though preparing for rapid departure. Williams had gone completely pale and was staring at the door as though it might explode. But the person standing on the other side of that door possessed information that would transform this carefully orchestrated ambush into the most devastating miscalculation that Linda Hartwell had ever made. The doorbell's resonance seemed to echo through the house with supernatural permanence, as though the sound itself had become a living entity that refused to dissipate. In the living room, 6 adults stood frozen in a tableau of anticipation and dread, each processing the implications of my announcement according to their own guilty consciences and hidden agendas. I walked toward the front door with deliberate slowness, savoring each step of this carefully choreographed revelation. Behind me, I could hear the rustle of papers as Patterson and Williams hastily attempted to organize their documents. The whispered exchange between Linda and Jessica that carried undertones of panic, and the subtle but unmistakable sound of expensive leather briefcases being snapped shut. They were preparing for retreat. As my hand reached for the doorknob, I glanced back at the assembled group and observed a fascinating study in human psychology under pressure. Patterson had assumed a defensive posture, his shoulders squared and his jaw set in the manner of a man preparing to justify questionable professional decisions. Williams appeared to be experiencing some form of internal crisis, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, fear, and what might have been genuine remorse. Linda stood perfectly still, her carefully applied makeup unable to conceal the pallor that had crept across her features. The confident manipulator who had orchestrated this elaborate ambush had been transformed into a woman confronting the possibility that her schemes might finally face consequences. Jessica had positioned herself partially behind her mother, as though seeking physical protection from whatever revelation awaited on the other side of that door. Her previous tears had been replaced by something approaching terror, and I realized that she understood the gravity of their situation better than Linda had anticipated. I opened the door. "Michael, thank you so much for including me in your family gathering," said the familiar voice that had guided me through the most challenging year of my life. "I hope I am not arriving at an inconvenient moment." Thomas Mitchell stood on the threshold, impeccably dressed in the navy suit that had been his professional uniform for over 3 decades. At 72 years old, he possessed the bearing of a man who had spent his career navigating complex legal situations and emerging victorious through preparation, intelligence, and unwavering ethical standards. But more importantly, Thomas Mitchell was the attorney who had prepared my father's will, the legal professional who had guided Robert Hartwell through the process of documenting his final wishes, and the one person in the world who possessed intimate knowledge of every aspect of the estate planning process that Linda was attempting to undermine. "Mr. Mitchell, your timing is absolutely perfect," I replied, stepping aside to allow him entry. "We were just discussing some interesting legal theories regarding my father's testamentary capacity." As Thomas Mitchell entered the living room, the atmosphere underwent a palpable transformation. The confident authority that Patterson and Williams had projected evaporated instantly, replaced by the nervous energy of junior attorneys who had suddenly found themselves in the presence of a legal legend. Thomas Mitchell's reputation in the field of estate law was formidable. He had practiced for 47 years, handling some of the most complex inheritance disputes in the state's history. His expertise was so widely recognized that other attorneys frequently consulted him on challenging cases. The idea that Patterson and Williams might attempt to challenge a will that had been prepared under Mitchell's supervision was professionally audacious to the point of career suicide. "Thomas Mitchell," he announced, extending his hand toward Patterson with the kind of cordial professionalism that somehow managed to convey both respect and warning. "I believe we may have spoken on the telephone recently, though under somewhat different circumstances." Patterson's face underwent a remarkable transformation as the implications of Mitchell's presence became clear. The confident attorney who had been prepared to intimidate me with threats of litigation suddenly appeared to be questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. "Mr. Mitchell, yes, of course. Your reputation precedes you. I am Richard Patterson from Patterson and Associates." "Ah, yes, Patterson and Associates," Mitchell replied, his tone carrying the kind of measured neutrality that experienced attorneys employ when they are preparing to deliver devastating information. "I have been reviewing some of your firm's recent work in estate litigation. Quite ambitious." The word ambitious hung in the air like a judicial pronouncement. In legal circles, describing another attorney's work as ambitious was equivalent to suggesting that they had exceeded the boundaries of professional ethics and sound judgment. Williams had retreated to the far corner of the living room, apparently hoping that distance might somehow protect him from the conversation that was about to unfold. His earlier nervousness had escalated into something approaching panic, and I suspected that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of the professional mistake he had made by accepting this case. Linda, however, was not prepared to surrender without attempting to maintain control of the narrative. She approached Mitchell with the same false warmth she had displayed earlier in the evening, extending her hand as though greeting an old family friend. "Thomas, how wonderful to see you again. I had no idea that Michael had invited you to join us tonight." "Mrs. Hartwell," Mitchell replied, accepting her handshake with professional courtesy while maintaining emotional distance. "I must confess that I was quite surprised to receive Michael's telephone call this week. He described a rather concerning situation involving attempts to contest your husband's will based on allegations of mental incompetence." The directness of Mitchell's statement cut through Linda's pretense like a surgical instrument. She had been prepared to manipulate family dynamics and exploit emotional vulnerabilities, but she was clearly unprepared to engage in substantive legal discourse with a professional who possessed comprehensive knowledge of the facts. "Thomas, I think there may have been some misunderstanding. We are simply trying to address some questions that have arisen regarding Robert's final wishes." "Questions?" Mitchell repeated, his eyebrows rising slightly. "That is interesting, Mrs. Hartwell, because the will I prepared for your husband was quite explicit in its language and intentions. Perhaps you could help me understand what aspects of the document you find unclear." Patterson attempted to interject, recognizing that Linda was not equipped to engage in this level of legal discussion. "Mr. Mitchell, we have obtained evidence suggesting that Mr. Robert Hartwell may not have possessed the requisite mental capacity to execute a valid will during his final months. Our investigation has revealed concerning testimony from multiple witnesses regarding his cognitive abilities." Mitchell turned his attention to Patterson with the focused intensity of a predator who had identified prey. Evidence, you say? That is fascinating, Mr. Patterson. I assume you are referring to the affidavits that were prepared following a series of leading interviews with carefully selected individuals who possessed limited knowledge of Mr. Hartwell's actual mental condition? The specificity of Mitchell's response indicated that he was not merely speculating about their methods. He possessed detailed knowledge of their activities. Furthermore, Mitchell continued, I assume you are also referring to the telephone call that someone from your office made to my firm last week, during which they posed as a journalist and attempted to elicit comments about Mr. Hartwell's cognitive abilities that could later be used to support claims of mental incompetence? Williams made a sound that might have been a gasp or a suppressed groan. The revelation that Mitchell was aware of their investigative methods had clearly caught both attorneys completely off guard. Mitchell reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small digital recording device. I have been practicing law for 47 years, Mr. Patterson. During that time, I have developed the habit of recording all telephone conversations that relate to potential legal proceedings. It helps to prevent misunderstandings and ensures that important details are preserved accurately. He placed the recording device on the coffee table where the settlement documents had been spread moments earlier. Would you like to hear the conversation in which someone claiming to represent a legal publication asked specific questions about Robert Hartwell's mental state, with particular emphasis on any signs of confusion or dementia that I might have observed during our meetings? Linda's face had progressed from pale to ashen. The confident manipulator who had orchestrated this elaborate ambush was beginning to understand that her schemes had been discovered and documented by professionals who possessed far more experience in legal warfare than she had anticipated. Of course, Mitchell continued, the person making those inquiries failed to identify themselves accurately, and the telephone number they provided traced back to a burner phone that was purchased with cash. However, the voice patterns and speaking mannerisms were quite distinctive. He turned toward Williams, who had been attempting to become invisible in the corner of the room. Mr. Williams, you have a very distinctive vocal inflection when you are nervous. It becomes quite pronounced when you are attempting to misrepresent your identity or intentions. Williams looked as though he might collapse. The realization that their covert investigation had been detected and recorded had apparently exceeded his capacity for professional composure. But Mitchell was not finished with his revelations. Mrs. Hartwell, I am also curious about the timing of your decision to pursue legal action against your stepson. According to my records, you first contacted Patterson and Associates approximately 6 weeks ago, which coincides interesting with your discovery that Michael had been consulting with me regarding potential inheritance fraud. Linda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She had been caught in a web of her own creation, and the sophisticated legal strategy that she had believed would intimidate me into submission was being systematically dismantled by someone who possessed superior knowledge and resources. How did you... she began, but Mitchell interrupted with a gesture. Mrs. Hartwell, one of the advantages of practicing law in the same community for nearly 5 decades is that professional relationships develop between attorneys, court personnel, and legal support staff. When someone begins making inquiries about contesting a will that I prepared, word tends to reach me rather quickly. He opened his own briefcase and withdrew a folder that was significantly thicker than the documents Patterson and Williams had prepared. I have spent the past 6 weeks conducting my own investigation into the circumstances surrounding this potential legal challenge. The results have been quite illuminating. Patterson was clearly struggling to maintain professional composure while recognizing that his position had become untenable. Mr. Mitchell, I can assure you that our firm has conducted this investigation according to the highest professional standards. Have you, Mr. Patterson? Then perhaps you can explain why 3 of the witnesses who provided affidavits regarding Mr. Hartwell's mental condition have subsequently contacted my office to report that they were pressured into making statements that did not accurately reflect their actual observations. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Linda grabbed the back of a chair for support, while Jessica made a sound that might have been either a sob or a gasp of terror. Furthermore, Mitchell continued relentlessly, perhaps you can explain why your firm accepted a retainer fee that was paid through a cashier's check purchased with funds from Robert Hartwell's life insurance policy, funds that were intended to support his widow during her period of grief, rather than finance legal attacks against his explicitly stated final wishes. The methodical destruction of their legal strategy was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Mitchell had not only anticipated their arguments but had gathered evidence that exposed the fundamental dishonesty underlying their entire approach. Patterson was clearly recognizing that continued participation in this scheme would likely result in professional sanctions and potential criminal charges. "Mr. Mitchell, I believe there may have been some miscommunication regarding the scope and nature of our investigation. If we have inadvertently pursued inappropriate methods..." "Mr. Patterson," Mitchell interrupted with the kind of quiet authority that had made him legendary in courtrooms across the state. "There was nothing inadvertent about your methods. You accepted a case that you knew lacked merit, employed investigative techniques that bordered on fraud, and attempted to use intimidation and emotional manipulation to coerce a legitimate beneficiary into surrendering assets that belonged to him by right." He turned his attention back to Linda, who was now visibly trembling with either rage or fear. "Mrs. Hartwell, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your husband spent considerable time discussing his testamentary decisions with me during our final meetings. He was not confused, manipulated, or coerced. He was a man who had reached the end of his life with absolute clarity about the character and motivations of his family members." Mitchell paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle throughout the room. "Robert Hartwell told me explicitly that he expected you to challenge his will. He predicted that you would claim mental incompetence, allege undue influence, and attempt to pressure Michael into surrendering his inheritance through guilt and legal threats. He asked me to prepare for exactly the scenario that has unfolded tonight." The silence that followed this revelation was profound and devastating. Linda had spent over a year believing that she was implementing a sophisticated strategy that would ultimately succeed through persistence and professional legal assistance. The discovery that her husband had anticipated every aspect of her plan and prepared countermeasures was clearly beyond her capacity to process. Jessica was openly crying now, not the calculated tears she had displayed earlier, but the genuine anguish of someone who was beginning to understand the true extent of her family's dysfunction. "He knew?" she whispered. "Daddy knew what we were going to do?" Mitchell's expression softened slightly as he looked at Jessica, recognizing that she had been manipulated by her mother rather than serving as the primary architect of this scheme. "Your father loved you, Jessica, but he also understood that love and financial support are not the same thing. He believed that giving you money would enable behaviors that would ultimately be destructive to your character and your future." He returned his attention to Linda, his voice resuming its previous tone of professional judgment. "Mrs. Hartwell, you now have a choice to make. You can withdraw this fraudulent legal challenge, accept your husband's clearly stated final wishes, and attempt to rebuild some semblance of family relationships based on honesty and mutual respect." He gestured toward Patterson and Williams, who were clearly preparing for immediate departure. "Or you can continue pursuing this course of action, knowing that I will submit a formal complaint to the state bar regarding your attorney's professional conduct, provide evidence to the district attorney's office regarding potential inheritance fraud, and ensure that every aspect of your manipulative behavior becomes a matter of public record." The ultimatum was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who possessed overwhelming evidence and unlimited resources to pursue justice. Patterson was already gathering his documents, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Mrs. Hartwell, I believe this concludes our consultation this evening. My firm will be in contact regarding the termination of our representation." Williams was moving toward the door with the desperate haste of someone fleeing a crime scene. "Mr. Patterson," Mitchell called after them, "I trust that you will advise your client to cease all contact with Michael regarding this matter. Any further attempts at coercion or intimidation will be considered criminal harassment." The two attorneys departed with indecent speed, leaving Linda, Jessica, and me alone with Thomas Mitchell in the living room that had been intended to serve as the venue for my financial destruction. Linda stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the scattered remains of her elaborate scheme. The settlement documents that had been prepared to legitimize her extortion attempt lay abandoned on the coffee table. The carefully arranged furniture bore witness to ambitions that had been comprehensively demolished by superior preparation and professional expertise. "This is not over," she said finally, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who was attempting to maintain defiance in the face of absolute defeat. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mitchell replied with the patience of someone addressing a particularly stubborn child. "Yes, it is over. Your husband made his decision based on 40 years of observation and careful consideration. That decision has been documented, witnessed, and legally validated. No amount of manipulation, fraud, or legal theatrics will change the fundamental reality of his final wishes." He turned toward me, his expression softening into something approaching paternal pride. "Michael, your father would be extraordinarily proud of how you have handled this situation. You have demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and strength that he hoped to encourage through his testamentary decisions." As Thomas Mitchell gathered his materials and prepared to leave, Linda made one final attempt to salvage some measure of control from the wreckage of her ambitions. Robert would roll over in his grave if he knew his son was keeping money that should support his widow and daughter. Mitchell paused at the doorway, turning back to face Linda with an expression of infinite weariness. "Mrs. Hartwell, Robert knew exactly what kind of woman he married. He spent his final weeks making arrangements to ensure that his widow would be provided for, through Social Security, pension benefits, and life insurance proceeds that total more than $100,000. The money he left to Michael was never intended to subsidize your lifestyle. It was intended to reward integrity and hard work." He opened the front door, allowing the cool evening air to flow into the overheated atmosphere of the living room. "Michael, I will expect your call on Monday morning. We have some additional documentation to prepare just in case Mrs. Hartwell decides to pursue this matter through other channels." The door closed behind Thomas Mitchell, leaving the three of us alone in a silence that was heavy with the weight of exposed truths and shattered illusions. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice barely audible through her tears. "Mama, what have we done?" But Linda Hartwell, standing amidst the ruins of her carefully constructed scheme, was not yet prepared to accept defeat, and the expression that flickered across her face as she stared at the closed door suggested that she was already formulating one final desperate strategy that would either restore her power or destroy what remained of the Hartwell family forever. The silence that settled over the living room after Thomas Mitchell's departure was unlike any quiet I had ever experienced. It was not merely the absence of sound, but rather the profound stillness that follows the collapse of elaborate deceptions and the exposure of fundamental truths. Linda stood motionless in the center of the room, her carefully constructed facade finally stripped away to reveal the desperate, manipulative woman she had always been beneath the veneer of maternal concern. Jessica remained huddled in her chair, tears streaming down her face as the full magnitude of their actions became clear. For the first time in her adult life, she was confronting the reality that her mother's influence had led her down a path of moral corruption that could have resulted in criminal charges and permanent family destruction. I found myself experiencing an unexpected sense of calm. The anxiety and dread that had plagued me for over a year had evaporated, replaced by something approaching peace. The psychological warfare that had consumed so much of my emotional energy was finally concluded, and I could begin the process of moving forward without the constant threat of manipulation and coercion. Linda's voice, when she finally spoke, carried none of its previous theatrical quality. The artificial sweetness had been replaced by raw bitterness, and for the first time in my memory, she was speaking without attempting to manipulate her audience. "You have destroyed this family, Michael. Your father's memory, everything we built together, all of it ruined because you could not find it in your heart to share what should have been ours by right." The accusation was predictable, but it no longer possessed the power to generate guilt or self-doubt. Thomas Mitchell's revelations had provided me with absolute clarity about my father's intentions and the legitimacy of my position. "Mother," I replied, my voice steady and composed, "this family was destroyed long before Father's death. It was destroyed by years of criticism, manipulation, and emotional abuse. Tonight was simply the moment when that destruction became visible to everyone involved. Jessica looked up from her tears, her face reflecting a mixture of confusion and dawning awareness. Michael, I never wanted it to go this far. When Mama said we could just talk to some lawyers, get some advice about our options, I never thought we would end up threatening you or trying to. Her voice trailed off as she struggled to find words for the magnitude of their attempted fraud. I walked over to where Jessica was sitting and knelt down beside her chair, speaking with the gentleness that I remembered from our childhood before Linda's influence had poisoned our relationship. Jessica, I understand that you were following Mother's lead, but you are 28 years old now, and you have to take responsibility for your own decisions. Tonight, you participated in an attempted theft of my inheritance. If Thomas Mitchell had not intervened, you could have faced criminal charges for fraud. The words were harsh, but they needed to be spoken. Jessica had spent her entire adult life allowing Linda to make decisions for her, and the consequences of that passivity had nearly resulted in legal catastrophe. I know, she whispered. I know, and I am so ashamed. When those lawyers started talking about challenging the will and getting witnesses to say Daddy was confused, I knew it was wrong, but Mama said it was the only way to get what we deserved. What we deserved. The phrase encapsulated the fundamental flaw in Linda's worldview, the belief that financial security was an entitlement rather than something that must be earned through hard work and responsible behavior. Linda, however, was not prepared to accept responsibility for the evening's catastrophic failure. Do not listen to him, Jessica. Michael has been poisoned against his own family by that lawyer and his father's ridiculous ideas about who deserves what. We are the ones who lived with Robert's moods, his limitations, his constant worry about money that we could never spend. We are the ones who sacrificed our dreams to accommodate his small-minded vision of success. The outburst revealed more about Linda's true feelings than any of her previous manipulations. For the first time, she was expressing her genuine resentment toward my father, without attempting to disguise it as concern for family unity. You sacrificed your dreams? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. What dreams did you sacrifice, Mother? I could have married Charles Whitman, she said, her voice carrying the bitterness of decades-old regret. He asked me to marry him 6 months before I met your father. Charles went on to become a successful investment banker. His wife drives a Mercedes, lives in a house with 6 bedrooms, travels to Europe every summer. That could have been my life if I had not settled for a man who was content to work with his hands for 40 years. The confession was shocking in its selfishness and historical revisionism. Linda had constructed an entire mythology around the life she believed she deserved, comparing her actual existence to a fantasy that had never been realistic. Mother, you chose to marry Father. You chose to have children with him. You chose to stay married to him for 38 years. Those were your decisions, and they came with consequences, both positive and negative. You cannot rewrite history to justify stealing from your own son. Stealing? Linda's voice rose to nearly a shriek. That money belongs to this family. Your father may have written your name on some legal documents, but morally, ethically, that money should be shared among the people who supported him throughout his life. The argument was simultaneously predictable and infuriating. Linda was attempting to override legal documents and explicit final wishes with her own interpretation of moral entitlement. Father supported this family for 42 years, I replied. He worked in all kinds of weather, came home exhausted every evening, saved every possible dollar, and never once complained about the sacrifices he was making. The money he left to me represents his life's work and his final expression of love and confidence in my character. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece where a photograph of my parents' wedding day had been displayed for decades. In the picture, my father looked genuinely happy, his face radiating the optimism of a young man who believed he was beginning a life with someone who shared his values and dreams. He left you that money because you were the only one who never criticized his career choices, never expressed embarrassment about his profession, never made him feel inadequate for choosing honest work over social status. Jessica was listening intently, and I could see her beginning to understand the broader context of my father's decision. Jessica, do you remember the last conversation you had with Father before he died? She nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes again. You told him that you hoped he would figure out a way to leave us something better than debt and disappointment. You said that exact phrase. I was standing in the hospital corridor and heard every word. The memory was clearly painful for Jessica, but it was important for her to understand how her words had affected our father during his final weeks. Those were among the last words our father heard from his younger daughter. Not, "I love you," not, "Thank you for providing for us," but disappointment that his life's work was not sufficient to meet your expectations. Linda attempted to interrupt, but I continued speaking. Mother, your last significant conversation with Father was about how embarrassed you were to tell your friends that your husband was still working construction at his age. You suggested that other men his age had moved on to better things, and asked why he could not show some ambition for once in his life. The recitation of these painful memories was difficult, but it was necessary for both Linda and Jessica to understand that my father's testamentary decisions had been based on years of observation and consideration, not momentary confusion or external manipulation. So when you ask why Father left his money to me instead of dividing it equally among his family members, the answer is simple. I was the only family member who ever treated him with respect and appreciation. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Jessica gradually began to acknowledge the ways in which Linda's influence had shaped her attitudes toward our father and his chosen profession. She expressed genuine remorse for her behavior and asked whether there might be some way to repair the damage that had been done to our relationship. Linda, however, remained defiant until the very end. She refused to acknowledge any responsibility for the evening's events, continued to insist that my father's will was morally illegitimate regardless of its legal validity, and made it clear that she viewed my refusal to surrender portions of my inheritance as an act of family betrayal that she would never forgive. As the evening drew to a close, I realized that this confrontation had provided me with something I had not expected: absolute clarity about the nature of my family relationships and the path forward. 3 months later, I used a portion of my inheritance to establish Hartwell Construction, a company dedicated to providing honest, high-quality building services to clients who valued craftsmanship over flashy marketing. The first project was a kitchen renovation for an elderly widow who had been quoted exorbitant prices by contractors who assumed she could be easily exploited. Jessica contacted me 6 weeks after that Saturday evening, expressing her desire to rebuild our relationship and asking whether I might be willing to help her find employment that would allow her to support herself independently. We began meeting for coffee once a month, slowly reconstructing the sibling bond that had been damaged by years of Linda's manipulation. Linda never contacted me again directly, though I occasionally heard reports from mutual acquaintances about her ongoing financial difficulties and her continued bitterness about my father's testamentary decisions. She had apparently exhausted her life insurance proceeds within 8 months, largely due to poor financial decisions and her insistence on maintaining a lifestyle that her actual income could not support. Thomas Mitchell became not only my legal advisor, but also a mentor and friend. He helped me understand that protecting my inheritance had been about more than money. It had been about honoring my father's memory and refusing to enable destructive behavior that would have ultimately harmed everyone involved. On the first anniversary of my father's death, I visited his grave and placed a small plaque beside his headstone. The inscription read, "Robert Hartwell, 1950-2023. Beloved father who taught his son that integrity is the most valuable inheritance." As I stood in that quiet cemetery, reflecting on the events of the past year, I realized that my father's final gift had been far more valuable than $200,000. He had given me the opportunity to discover my own strength, develop my own moral compass, and learn to defend my principles against those who would compromise them for personal gain. The money had enabled me to start my business and build a secure future. But the real inheritance had been the lesson that sometimes protecting what matters most requires the courage to stand alone against those who claim to love you while working to destroy you. I thought about the Saturday evening when Linda had attempted to steal my inheritance through legal coercion and emotional manipulation. Her elaborate scheme had failed not because I was particularly clever or well prepared, but because the truth has a power that sophisticated lies cannot overcome. My father had been right to trust me with his life savings. He had been right to believe that I would use the money responsibly and honor the values he had tried to instill in me. Most importantly, he had been right to understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal is painful for everyone involved. Standing in that cemetery, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived and legacies carefully preserved, I made a promise to my father's memory. I would continue to build things that would outlast me, treat people with honesty and respect, and never allow anyone to manipulate me into compromising my principles for the sake of artificial peace. The inheritance dispute had been resolved, but the real work of honoring my father's memory was just beginning. 2 years later, Hartwell Construction had grown into a respected company with 12 employees and a reputation for exceptional quality and ethical business practices. Jessica had found meaningful employment as a social worker and was rebuilding her life according to her own values rather than Linda's expectations. Even Linda had eventually found some measure of stability, though our relationship remained permanently severed. The money my father left me had provided the foundation for financial security and professional success. But the real treasure had been the lesson that integrity cannot be purchased, manipulated, or stolen. It can only be earned through consistent choices to do what is right, even when doing so requires significant personal sacrifice. As I reflect on those challenging months when my family attempted to destroy everything my father had worked to build, I am grateful for the experience, painful as it was. It taught me that love without respect is merely possession, that family relationships built on manipulation will eventually collapse under the weight of their own dishonesty, and that sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. My father's inheritance was not just money. It was a test of character that revealed who I truly was and who I was capable of becoming. I passed that test not through cleverness or legal maneuvering, but through the simple decision to honor his memory by living according to the principles he had taught me. The story of that Saturday evening when my mother tried to steal my inheritance has become a reminder that the most valuable things in life cannot be taken from us unless we voluntarily surrender them. My father's love, his respect for my character, and his confidence in my future, these were gifts that no amount of legal manipulation could ever diminish. And in the end, that was the inheritance that truly mattered. Now I want to ask you 2 important questions. First, if you were in my position facing the same family pressure, legal threats, and emotional manipulation, what would you have done differently? Would you have been strong enough to stand your ground, or would you have given in to keep the peace? Second, what city are you watching this story from right now? I'm curious to know where in the world people are dealing with similar family conflicts and inheritance disputes. Drop your city in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps someone else who might be facing similar challenges with family members who confuse love with control and loyalty with surrender.